Welcome to this compilation of short stories about conflict in space. I'll be narrating Asteroid H227+ by Harry Walton, Duel on Syrtis by Poul, Earthmen Ask No Quarter by Fox B. Holden, and Menace from Vega by Randall. For ad-free audio, video, and podcast forms of all my narrations, head over to my Substack, which is linked in the description. But for now, let's get to the stories, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. Asteroid H277+ by Harry Walton. Narrated by William Skye. It was a pretty web that Akers spun aboard the sun freighter Cinnabar. Mass murder and piracy. But he wasn't clever enough to allow for the innocent-sounding asteroid charted as H277+. John Akers, petty officer of the Sunline freighter Cinnabar, backed away from the jimmied manifold of the air circulators and hastily felt for the emergency mask at his belt. Any moment now, the Venusian Koh-i-Noor he had filched from the ship's medicine cabinet and dropped into the circulators would take effect. Without warning, men would drop at their posts, apparently insensible, rigid of muscle, eyes staring fixedly. Actually, they would be keenly aware of everything about them, their senses sharpened rather than dulled by the drug. But it was no part of Akers's plans to be one of them. He strapped on the mask, and at the sound of approaching footsteps, shrank back into the shadows of the machines. An officer peered into the circulator chamber for an instant, then marched on down the corridor. Akers chuckled. Box Jordan was part of his plan. In a way, he had a star role, but not an enviable one. Nor, to be sure, were the remainder of the Cinnabar's crew going to be particularly lucky. The luck of the scheme was reserved for Akers himself, and it involved 4 kilos of precious Irelium, which Box Jordan had unearthed during an emergency landing on an unexplored planetoid. Jordan had been fool enough to turn the stuff over as a ship's prize to be equally divided. But with the metal on board, it was inevitable that a smarter man would see and grasp the chance that was offered. Akers was that man. He waited until the circulation meters told him that the Koh-i-Noor had been diffused through every cubic foot of air in the ship, then softly trod the stellene-walled corridor back to the navigating compartment. The sight there was a gruesome one. Captain Cardigan was slumped over the chart table, glassy-eyed, to all appearance dead. But he wasn't dead, Akers knew. The captain and the chief petty officer and the second navigator and the supercargo, all sprawled in grotesque attitudes about the compartment, all staring vacantly into space, were in the grip of an artificially induced coma. Deliberately, Akers walked over and kicked Captain Cardigan in the chest. Cardigan's face remained impassive, the eyes expressionless, yet there was a barely perceptible quiver that told the blow had hurt. Akers grinned and landed another, then scowled and rubbed his ear with the back of a hairy hand. It was the first navigator, Box Jordan, whom he owed a special grudge. He'd nursed special ideas for Jordan, the agony of broken bones, of a merciless beating before death should wipe him out. But Jordan wasn't here. Built into the chart table was the fireproof compartment that held the ship's log. Akers removed the bulky volume, opened it upon the table, and ripped out the last 4 page entries, crumpling the thin metallic foil before throwing it to the floor. With the log would perish all records of the Irelium find. If any spaceman's notes or diary held mention of it, the Cinnabar's fate would destroy that also. Akers moved toward the control board, grasped the refrigeration controls, swung them to off. Immediately, alarm bells clanged warning. He could feel the horror which his act engendered in the men who helplessly watched it. Something of that horror chilled even him. For without refrigeration, the fuel tanks would quickly warm up. The compressed gaseous fuel, held inert only by refrigeration, would spontaneously explode. The cinnabar, by that simple movement of 2 levers, was doomed. The alarm bells echoed madly about him as he left the navigation compartment and walked further aft, to the stern deck where the ship's tender nestled against her hull. An airtight telescoping tube connected parent ship and life ship, and Akers saw that the manhole cover was slid aside. Someone was either in the tender or had just left it, perhaps one of the spacemen now lying beside the manhole on a routine maintenance job. Akers climbed the short ladder into the life ship's tiny control compartment. Lamps were burning, but there was nobody in the compartment, nor in the little vessel's supply compartment, engine room, or living quarters. Satisfied, Akers checked food stores, fuel, and air gauges with keen satisfaction. Everything was in perfect order. His scheme couldn't fail. Only a fool would have let a chance like this slip by. Then, thinking of Jordan again, Akers cursed. The lean, red-headed first navigator had been poison to him ever since joining the ship. Jordan hadn't been afraid of him. Other officers had excused or overlooked badly done or neglected work. Box Jordan never. The redhead had tongue-lashed Akers too often, and Akers had promised himself a meeting with Jordan. Jordan helpless, paralyzed, but fully conscious and able to feel every blow that fury could inflict. Now it seemed he was to be cheated of that. The clanging alarm reminded him that time was dangerously short. Soon the tanks would let go. He couldn't afford to be near the doomed freighter when the exploding fuel did its work. Without glancing back, he shut the entrance port, pressed the button that collapsed the escape tube, and took his place at the glowing controls of the little vessel. The cinnabar's death knell was muffled now. Like a tocsin of the dead, it rang dully in his ears as he reached for the levers. But confidence returned as he felt the familiar handles beneath him. The life ship was complete, self-sufficient. Charts were reduced to a simple form, instruments were direct reading, course plotting almost automatic, so that the commonest spaceman could navigate the tender at need. He had himself operated it during the cinnabar's emergency landing a month ago. He punched the internal combustion engines into life, watched the generator output mount, then cut in a weak repulsion field. With a lurch, the little ship tore free from its parent vessel and retreated from the long, gleaming shape of the freighter. He switched over to the space induction field coils. Power thrummed in the depths of the tiny craft. It swerved about and obediently plunged ahead, fleeing the coming tragedy. After 10 minutes at full field, he turned it around and held it motionless in space with respect to the now distant cinnabar. The slim freighter, gleaming gold in the light of the distant sun, seemed to float upon a soft, star-sprinkled darkness. There was no trace of movement, although she was still flying, with untended engines at 3/4 field. He bit his lips, waiting. Then, soundlessly, catastrophe struck. From amidships flowered a terrible consuming blossom of blue-white flame, a petalled fire that engulfed the cinnabar from bow to stern and limned itself fantastically against the velvet heavens behind. Streamers of white-hot gas, sun-like in intensity, burst and flared in the brief glory of destruction, then as swiftly collapsed upon themselves, dimmed to the lesser glow of molten metal. The cinnabar, a slender white-hot needle, broke into 1,000 dripping fragments, droplets of fire spattering the sky. Akers chuckled uneasily, swore, rubbed his ear with the back of a hand. That was that. Somewhere in the swirling, far-flung wreckage, he must find the tiny block of unbelievably heavy, practically indestructible uranium, flung out of the shattered strong room which he could have penetrated in no other way. The explosion should have released the treasure and wiped out all evidence against him at the same time. Like the rest of his plan, it was simple, direct, foolproof. He flung the little tender back through space toward the glowing debris which now milled about itself, spinning about a common center. A few fragments had ripped free from the gravitational whirlpool of the rest. He dodged a piece half as large as the life ship itself. Red-hot still, it swept past the port, more like a blazing meteor than anything made by man. Past other wreckage he swept, evidence of the terrific energy of spontaneously exploded fuel, gruesome human debris as well as that of the cinnabar itself. The temperature within the tender climbed slowly as it absorbed heat from glowing fragments outside. Uneasily, he checked his own fuel refrigerator, turned thermostatic controls to maintain a lower temperature. Something swept into his field of vision with startling speed. He ripped the helm over, swearing in sudden panic. The tender swerved, but not sharply enough. A grating shock, a metallic crash, told that the vessel had been hit. The jar of the concussion almost threw him from the control seat. His temples throbbing madly, Akers waited for the dread hiss of escaping air, the drop in pressure which his eardrums would quickly detect. The tender was small. A gash in the hull plates would empty it of air rapidly. But the pressure remained normal, and he relaxed at last, certain that the collision had done no more than dent the hull plates. He forgot the incident upon spying what had been the strong room door. Cautiously, he worked the tender alongside it, scanning nearby debris closely. It took him 15 minutes to find the thick-walled copper casket containing the treasure, scarred by impact, half-fused by the terrific heat, even though it had been protected by the walls of the strong room from the brunt of it. He knew that its precious contents could have suffered no harm, and carefully manipulated the ship's grappling mechanism until the casket was safely inside the tender's loading port. He swung the life ship about and drove for clear space. So easy it had been. A few minutes of effort had won him 10 times as much as the other men earned during a lifetime of hard, dangerous work in the space lanes. Lucky he wasn't squeamish by nature. This way he was safe. Every witness against him was dead. His own word would be taken as gospel truth. Already he had planned every detail of the story, how he had been on routine inspection of the tender when the explosion started forward in the fuel tanks, how the life ship with him aboard had been blown free by the blast, how he had barely managed to close the port in time to escape suffocation, how from the tender he had witnessed the destruction of the cinnabar, and how, a touching detail this, he had cruised back into the wreckage in search of survivors, but found none. He would not try to explain the explosion. The lethally dangerous nature of the fuel would answer all doubts. Nobody could suspect him. Just before landing, he would transfer the uranium to his own duffel bag, a new one, of course, stocked with clothing taken from the tender's supplies. A welding torch would reduce the copper casket to a lump of reddish metal. He would dispose of a little uranium illegally, outfit a one-man ship with the proceeds, and go on a prospecting cruise from which he could return with a legitimate store of the precious stuff. Disposed of to the Martians, who valued it as a healing agent, the 4 kilograms would bring a fortune. He pushed the little ship to top speed, which was slow at best. Hour after hour, he hurled its silvery nose toward the distant stars, on a course which his charts told him led to Earth. Mars, smaller than his own world, was on the other side of the sun. It was on Earth that automatic cameras would have snapped the explosion of the Cinnabar. Perhaps salvage ships were already on their way. In a few hours he might meet them. Glancing at the chronometer, he saw that it was safe to remove his mask. The last vestige of Kuinor, which might have entered the tender from the Cinnabar, would have decomposed by now. By this time it would also have decomposed in the blood of the drugged men had any remained alive to experience it. "Akers! Blast my orbit! What happened?" He whirled at the voice, all his fear surging up within him, choking him. In the doorway stood Box Jordan, his tall, lean figure swaying a little, keen eyes questioning. "Jordan? Where'd you come from?" "Routine inspection forward. I was checking the fuel tanks, started to back out of the tank compartment when I froze up. Couldn't move a toe." The navigator's sharp eyes narrowed. "What happened?" "Happened?" Akers fought the panic in his voice, the fear of this man who was not afraid of him. "Nothing much, just that the Cinnabar blew up." "Blew up? You mean we're the only survivors?" Akers shrugged. "I thought I was until you popped up. Of course I looked around. There wasn't anybody else." He stood up, stretching. "If you'll take over a while, I'll get the kinks out of me." For an instant, Jordan hesitated. Akers watched him closely. He suspected, of course. Knew that he had been drugged. Even when under the Kuinor, he must have felt the tender pull away from the Cinnabar, and that without any evidence of an explosion. In a moment, he would add things up, reaching the only possible conclusion. Desperately, Akers glanced about for a weapon. And Jordan, with a queer, twisted smile, walked forward, not toward the pilot seat, but toward Akers. Those big bony hands of his were working. His very silence was terrible. Akers flattened himself against a wall. Big as he was, he knew himself to be no match for the hard-muscled first navigator. Aroused as the latter now was, he would be doubly dangerous. Akers clawed the bare wall, breathing hard. "You drugged the air cycle," said Jordan. "You shut off the refrigerators and took off in the tender. You stood by while the Cinnabar went to hell with every man aboard her. Then you went back and picked up the Urulium." "No!" screamed Akers. "No, I swear I didn't." Jordan's hard fingers closed over his windpipe, crushed in his throat like a steel clamp tightened about it. He could feel his eyes bulging from their sockets, his body turning cold and dwindling away from him. He slumped suddenly, as though unconscious. A moment longer Jordan held him in that terrible grip, then flung him away. Akers hit the wall, collapsed into a huddled heap, gasping and retching as breath passed his bruised throat. He took his time, gathering strength, sure that Jordan would not attack him while he was down. Desperation lent him courage. Concerned, there was nothing to do but fight it out. He wouldn't let the navigator get another throat hold. Pretending to be weaker than he was, Akers lurched to his feet. He had a plan now, and warily circled Jordan before closing in. Then he plunged forward, ducked a swift uppercut, took a solid body blow that left him gasping, but reached the wall behind Jordan, which was his objective. A rack of oxygen tanks for use with spacesuits was fastened there. Akers' hands tore one free, a slender, blunt-ended cylinder, massive enough to be a dangerous club. As Jordan closed in, Akers brought it down on the navigator's left arm, which fell limp. With a bellow of triumph, Akers struck for the head. Jordan, still drug-hazy and crippled in one arm, took the blow on a temple. It stopped him like a shot. He crumpled to one knee and fell. Breath rattling in his swollen throat, Akers stared into the hated face and wondered whether he should finish the job with a few more blows. Caution whispered consent, but still he hesitated. This was Box Jordan. Box Jordan. Why kill him like this? He wanted Jordan to know what was coming, to know it as long as possible. It struck him then that killing Jordan wasn't as simple as it seemed. Found aboard the tender, Jordan's body would convict him. Flung into space this far from the Cinnabar disaster, it would provoke awkward questions, unanswerable questions, when discovered. Here was an unexpected flaw in a scheme that had looked foolproof. Cursing, Akers pulled the chartbook toward him. He had tied Jordan's feet and fastened his hands behind him, lashed to a wall railing. In a supply closet, he had found a paralysis gun, which he now wore in a side holster. For these and other reasons, he was as confident when Jordan showed signs of returning life as he had been at first. Grinning, he watched the navigator stir and weakly sit up. "Coming out of it, are you? Listen to me, Jordan. I've got the Eurulium aboard. Want to come in on this with me?" Jordan rubbed his temple tenderly. "I suppose there isn't much choice." Akers chuckled. "You'll come in, huh? And spill the first chance you get. I'd be asking for the mercury mines if I took you back. Skip it, Jordan. I was kidding." "So was I," the navigator smiled crookedly. "But when it comes to teaming up with a rat, I'm ashamed of myself for even kidding about it." Akers struck out, a hard, flat hand blow that rocked Jordan's head and left red welts on his cheek. "You know what? I've got your spot picked out. Nice and cool. No air except what'll be in your suit tank, and about as much chance of rescue as an ice cube in hell." He picked up the chart book and with ruffled brow turned its aluminium foil pages, his tongue between his lips. The page found, he held it before Jordan. "See that? A dinky space apple that's been passed up by every claiming bureau in the system. 10 miles through. Just big enough to keep you from drifting free where a nosy patrol ship might find you. It's the nearest asteroid. I'd dump you on Pluto if it weren't out of my way." "Asteroid H277+, read Jordan calmly. "Not exactly exciting. Why not ray me here and chuck out the remains?" Akers swore. "Because you're supposed to be with what's left of the Cinnabar, damn you. I can't take you back there. Salvage ships may be out by now. And I can't throw you out where you may be picked up by a patrol. I've got to ditch you where you'll stay put." "So it's H277+ for me," murmured Jordan. "The plus part of it sounds interesting. What does it mean, Akers?" "How the hell would I know? And what do you care? You won't live long enough to worry about it." But Akers himself was worrying as the asteroid floated into sight. He'd had to go off course to reach it when he should be making a beeline for Earth. There was a slight chance that the tender might be observed stopping here, a risk he had to take, but which could be minimized by haste. To cut the time shorter, he'd let Jordan wear a spacesuit and walk out of the airlock. That would save time. Otherwise, if he killed Jordan on board, there would be some delay while he disposed of the body. Besides, there was a savage satisfaction in marooning the navigator alive, in letting him live out those last hopeless hours in slow torture of body and mind. Akers himself shuddered as he thought of it, the fate reserved for murderers taken aboard ship. A 10-hour tank of oxygen and a barren island of the sky such as this. Asteroid H277+ was a bleak lump of pitted rock, roughly oval in shape, gleaming where the sunlight fell, pitch black in the shadows. No ship would ever come close enough to it to make out a man's body, even if it lay in the light. In fact, spaceships avoided such masses as this just as the ancient steamers avoided icebergs. The chance of rescue was practically non-existent. "Almost there, aren't we?" asked Jordan from the floor. "What do I do, a swan dive from the emergency lock?" Akers shut off power, held the tender immovable by a weak repulsion field, and freed the navigator's feet. "You get in a suit, and don't try any tricks or I'll beam you." He watched sharply as Jordan meekly obeyed and climbed into the stiff canvas garment. Akers set the helmet over his head and fastened the rim studs, tearing off the collar bridge bearing the legend SS Cinnabar. "If you are ever found, you won't be recognized. They say a body loses heat slowly enough for decomposition to make a good start in one of these suits. When we land, you close your faceplate and go out through the lock." He watched Jordan narrowly as he jockeyed the ship closer to the tiny asteroid. Without knowing why, he was uneasy. Jordan was a fighter. Funny he'd go out like this, the hard way, without a scrap. But what could he do? If he didn't march out of the lock under his own power, Akers could beam him and throw him out through the loading port. Asteroid H277+ swam up to meet the ship. Akers picked his landing spot and reduced his repulsion field carefully. The ship settled. Jordan seemed to stiffen expectantly. Akers lifted the paralysis gun from its holster. Directly beneath, the basalt blackness of the asteroid shimmered oddly with a strange translucent light. Akers swore softly. There couldn't be anything down there. A trick of the sunlight, perhaps the shadow of the ship. But it was queer. Maybe he shouldn't land, just make Jordan jump from the ship. That was it. His eyes flickered to the navigator, stiff as a ramrod now, with that tense air of waiting for something to happen. Akers tightened his grip on the gun, jerked his eyes back to the asteroid, and froze with fear. From the basalt surface leaped a fountain of fire, cold, leaping fire, licking upward at the ship. He jerked the controls over to full repulsion, screamed in terror as the ship dipped further instead of rising. An electrical flame sprang to meet it, a snapping, snarling fury of saw-edged lightning. Incredulously, he saw it leave the prow of the vessel, flicker back to strike white flame from the hull plates just over the fuel tanks forward. A muffled roar beat upon his ears. Flame billowed forth before the pilot glass. The ship trembled and shuddered to the force of unleashed gases. Acrid fumes swirled over the control board and seeped from the very floor plates beneath his feet. Through drifting smoke, he saw the deck curl back, white-hot, and drift lazily out of sight like a burnt leaf. His eardrums snapped as air fled into space. Vaguely, he saw the black surface of the asteroid fly upward, felt a crunch and crash of metal as it exploded in his face, and fell through senseless darkness. "So you're alive." It was Box Jordan's voice, Akers realized, as he awoke to painful consciousness. Parts of him seemed to be on fire. He was wearing a spacesuit, as Jordan was, and they were no longer in the ship, but on the asteroid. "Hard time getting you into a suit when the ship's air went," remarked the navigator, his voice loud in Akers' earphones. "Of course I knew what was coming and had only to close my faceplate, just as you told me. But I wanted to save you particularly. They need good, tough murderers like you at the mines. Some last as long as 5 years, I hear." Akers tried to sit up, discovered that he was bound, and that Jordan had the paralysis gun now. "I found the Euruleum," continued the navigator. "The Cinnabar's widows and orphans will get their share after all." "What happened?" asked Akers thickly. "That explosion?" "Only a feeble imitation of the Cinnabar's. Don't forget that her fuel exploded spontaneously with 1,000 times the force. In our case, the fuel was inert because our refrigeration didn't fail. It burnt once ignited, but without an explosion, just as I expected. What I didn't tell you, Akers, was that the collision you had near the wrecked Cinnabar knocked a hole in one fuel tank. I was lying almost against it, almost froze too, and for hours I could hear fuel leaking out through the rip. Not much, just enough to catch fire when that spark hit us, and to carry back and ignite the whole tank." Akers groaned. "That spark! That damn spark!" Jordan was staring into space. He rose and looked long, then sat down again. "We're rescued, Akers. Naturally, the salvage ships kept a lookout for the missing life ship and saw the flare-up here. They'll arrive soon." "That spark," groaned Akers. "What the devil was it?" "That was what you weren't interested in, Akers. The plus of H277+. Did you know that the Earth and most planets are negatively charged, have a surplus of electrons? And that our ships are also negatively charged, in fact supercharged because of the driving fields we use? A planetoid or asteroid with a simple name or number is also negative, and no precautions are necessary. But a plus following the designation means it is positively charged, whether because of interacting gravitational fields, internal radioactivity, or induction between the body and an atmosphere, or some other reason. When an accredited navigator has to land on a plus body, he orders a careful check of all fuel tanks, because he knows there will be a heavy electrical discharge between it and the ship just before landing. But you didn't know that. Another thing you didn't know, being a petty and not a commissioned officer, is that a new ITC ruling requires an exact duplicate of the ship's log to be kept aboard life tenders at all times. Just before I went back to the tanks, I replaced that duplicate logbook. You took it along, Akers, and I found it when I found the Euruleum, safe and sound in its fireproof case. That's what will convict you, Akers, not my words, but the story of the Euruleum find and my turning it over as a ship's prize, written and signed by Captain Cardigan himself. The ITC would have found that duplicate log anyhow, Akers. You never really had a chance to get away with it. Funny, isn't it? Funny how dumb a smart guy can be.
If you're enjoying the stories, I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button to help the channel grow. Thanks.
Duel on Syrtis by Poul Anderson. Narrated by William Skye. The night whispered the message. Over the many miles of loneliness it was borne, carried on the wind, rustled by the half-sentient lichens and the dwarfed trees, murmured from one to another of the little creatures that huddled under crags, in caves, by shadowy dunes. In no words, but in a dim pulsing of dread which echoed through Krieger's brain, the warning ran, "They are hunting again." Krieger shuddered in a sudden blast of wind. The night was enormous around him, above him, from the iron bitterness of the hills to the wheeling, glittering constellations light years over his head. He reached out with his trembling perceptions, tuning himself to the brush and the wind and the small burrowing things underfoot, letting the night speak to him. Alone, alone. There was not another Martian for 100 miles of emptiness. There were only the tiny animals and the shivering brush and the thin, sad blowing of the wind. The voiceless scream of dying travelled through the brush from plant to plant, echoed by the fear pulses of the animals and the ringingly reflecting cliffs. They were curling, shrivelling, and blackening as the rocket poured the glowing death down on them, and the withering veins and nerves cried to the stars. Krieger huddled against a tall, gaunt crag. His eyes were like yellow moons in the darkness, cold with terror and hate and a slowly gathering resolution. Grimly, he estimated that the death was being sprayed in a circle some 10 miles across. And he was trapped in it, and soon the hunter would come after him. He looked up to the indifferent glitter of stars, and a shudder went along his body. Then he sat down and began to think. It had started a few days before in the private office of the trader Wisby. "I came to Mars," said Riordan, "to get me an owlie." Wisby had learned the value of a poker face. He peered across the rim of his glass at the other man, estimating him. Even in godforsaken holes like Port Armstrong one had heard of Riordan. Heir to $1 million shipping firm, which he himself had pyramided into a system-wide monster, he was equally well known as a big game hunter. From the fire drakes of Mercury to the ice crawlers of Pluto, he'd bagged them all. Except, of course, a Martian. That particular game was forbidden now. He sprawled in his chair, big and strong and ruthless, still a young man. He dwarfed the unkempt room with his size and the hard-held dynamo strength in him, and his cold green gaze dominated the trader. "It's illegal, you know," said Wisby. "It's a 20-year sentence if you're caught at it." "Bah! The Martian commissioner is at Ares, halfway round the planet. If we go at it right, who's ever to know?" Riordan gulped at his drink. "I'm well aware that in another year or so they'll have tightened up enough to make it impossible. This is the last chance for any man to get an owlie. That's why I'm here." Wisby hesitated, looking out the window. Port Armstrong was no more than a dusty huddle of domes, interconnected by tunnels in a red waste of sand stretching to the near horizon. An Earthman in airsuit and transparent helmet was walking down the street, and a couple of Martians were lounging against a wall. Otherwise, nothing. A silent, deadly monotony brooding under the shrunken sun. Life on Mars was not especially pleasant for a human. "You're not falling into this owlie-loving that's corrupted all Earth?" demanded Riordan contemptuously. "Oh, no," said Wisby. "I keep them in their place around my post. But times are changing. It can't be helped." "There was a time when they were slaves," said Riordan. "Now those old women on Earth want to give 'em the vote." He snorted. "Well, times are changing," repeated Wisby mildly. "When the first humans landed on Mars 100 years ago, Earth had just gone through the hemispheric wars. The worst wars man had ever known. They damn near wrecked the old ideas of liberty and equality. People were suspicious and tough. They'd had to be to survive. They weren't able to empathize the Martians, or whatever you call it. Not able to think of them as anything but intelligent animals. And Martians made such useful slaves. They need so little food or heat or oxygen, they can even live 15 minutes or so without breathing at all. And the wild Martians made fine sport, intelligent game that could get away as often as not, or even manage to kill the hunter. I know, said Riordan. That's why I want to hunt one. It's no fun if the game doesn't have a chance. It's different now, went on Wisby. Earth has been at peace for a long time. The Liberals have gotten the upper hand. Naturally, one of their first reforms was to end Martian slavery. Riordan swore. The forced repatriation of Martians working on his spaceships had cost him plenty. I haven't time for your philosophizing, he said. If you can arrange for me to get a Martian, I'll make it worth your while. How much worth it? Asked Wisby. They haggled for a while before settling on a figure. Riordan had brought guns and a small rocket boat, but Wisby would have to supply radioactive material, a hawk, and a rockhound. Then he had to be paid for the risk of legal action, though that was small. The final price came high. Now, where do I get my Martian? Inquired Riordan. He gestured at the two in the street. Catch one of them and release him in the desert? It was Wisby's turn to be contemptuous. One of them? Ha! Town loungers. A city dweller from Earth would give you a better fight. The Martians didn't look impressive. They stood only some 4 feet high on skinny, claw-footed legs, and the arms, ending in bony 4-fingered hands, were stringy. The chests were broad and deep, but the waists were ridiculously narrow. They were viviparous, warm-blooded, and suckled their young, but grey feathers covered their hides. The round, hook-beaked heads with huge amber eyes and tufted feather ears showed the origin of the name Owlie. They wore only pouched belts and carried sheath knives. Even the Liberals of Earth weren't ready to allow the natives modern tools and weapons. There were too many old grudges. The Martians always were good fighters, said Riordan. They wiped out quite a few Earth settlements in the old days. The wild ones, agreed Wisby, but not these. They're just stupid labourers, as dependent on our civilization as we are. You want a real old-timer, and I know where one's to be found. He spread a map on the desk. See, here in the Earthnian Hills, about 100 miles from here. These Martians live a long time, maybe 2 centuries, and this fellow Krieger has been around since the first Earthmen came. He led a lot of Martian raids in the early days, but since the general amnesty and peace, he's lived all alone up there in one of the old ruined towers. A real old-time warrior who hates Earthmen's guts. He comes here once in a while with furs and minerals to trade, so I know a little about him. Wisby's eyes gleamed savagely. You'd be doing us all a favour by shooting the arrogant bastard. He struts around here as if the place belonged to him. And he'll give you a run for your money. Riordan's massive dark head nodded in satisfaction. The man had a bird and a rockhound. That was bad. Without them, Krieger could lose himself in the labyrinth of caves and canyons and scrubby thickets, but the hound could follow his scent and the bird could spot him from above. To make matters worse, the man had landed near Krieger's tower. The weapons were all there. Now he was cut off, unarmed and alone save for what feeble help the desert life could give. unless he could double back to the place somehow. But meanwhile he had to survive. He sat in a cave, looking down past a tortured wilderness of sand and bush and wind-carved rock, miles in the thin, clear air to the glitter of metal where the rocket lay. The man was a tiny speck in the huge, barren landscape, a lonely insect crawling under the deep blue sky. Even by day the stars glistened in the tenuous atmosphere. Weak, pallid sunlight spilled over rocks tawny and ochreous and rust-red, over the low, dusty thorn bushes and the gnarled little trees and the sand that blew faintly between them. Equatorial Mars. Lonely or not, the man had a gun that could spang death clear to the horizon, and he had his beasts, and there would be a radio in the rocket boat for calling his fellows. And the glowing death ringed them in, a charmed circle which Krieger could not cross without bringing a worse death on himself than the rifle would give. Or was there a worse death than that? To be shot by a monster and have his stuffed hide carried back as a trophy for fools to gape at. The old iron pride of his race rose in Krieger, hard and bitter and unrelenting. He didn't ask much of life these days, solitude in his tower to think the long thoughts of a Martian and create the small exquisite artworks which he loved, the company of his kind at the gathering season, grave ancient ceremony and acrid merriment, and the chance to beget and rear sons. An occasional trip to the Earthling settling for the metal goods and the wine which were the only valuable things they had brought to Mars. A vague dream of raising his folk to a place where they could stand as equals before all the universe. No more. And now they would take even this from him. He rasped a curse on the human and resumed his patient work, chipping a spearhead for what puny help it could give him. The brush rustled dryly in alarm, tiny hidden animals squeaked their terror, the desert shouted to him of the monster that strode toward his cave. But he didn't have to flee right away. Riordan sprayed the heavy metal isotope in a 10-mile circle around the old tower. He did that by night, just in case patrol craft might be snooping around. But once he had landed, he was safe. He could always claim to be peacefully exploring, hunting leapers or some such thing. The radioactive had a half-life of about 4 days, which meant that it would be unsafe to approach for some 3 weeks, 2 at the minimum. That was time enough when the Martian was boxed in so small an area. There was no danger that he would try to cross it. The Owlies had learned what radioactivity meant back when they fought the humans, and their vision, extending well into the ultraviolet, made it directly visible to them through its fluorescence, to say nothing of the wholly unhuman extra senses they had. No, Krieger would try to hide and perhaps to fight, and eventually he'd be cornered. Still, there was no use taking chances. Riordan set a timer on the boat's radio. If he didn't come back within 2 weeks to turn it off, it would emit a signal which Wisby would hear, and he'd be rescued. He checked his other equipment. He had an airsuit designed for Martian conditions, with a small pump operated by a power beam from the boat to compress the atmosphere sufficiently for him to breathe it. The same unit recovered enough water from his breath so that the weight of supplies for several days was, in Martian gravity, not too great for him to bear. He had a .45 rifle built to shoot in Martian air, that was heavy enough for his purposes, and of course compass and binoculars and sleeping bag. Pretty light equipment, but he preferred a minimum anyway. For ultimate emergencies, there was the little tank of suspensine. By turning a valve, he could release it into his air system. The gas didn't exactly induce suspended animation, but it paralyzed efferent nerves,
and slowed the overall metabolism to a point where a man could live for weeks on one lungful of air. It was useful in surgery, and had saved the life of more than one interplanetary explorer whose oxygen system went awry. But Riordan didn't expect to have to use it. He certainly hoped he wouldn't. It would be tedious to lie fully conscious for days waiting for the automatic signal to call Wisby. He stepped out of the boat and locked it. No danger that the owl would break in if he should double back. It would take Tordonite to crack that hull. He whistled to his animals. They were native beasts, long ago domesticated by the Martians and later by man. The rockhound was like a gaunt wolf, but huge-breasted and feathered, a tracker as good as any terrestrial bloodhound. The hawk had less resemblance to its counterpart of Earth. It was a bird of prey, but in the tenuous atmosphere it needed a 6-foot wingspread to lift its small body. Riordan was pleased with their training. The hound bayed, a low, quavering note which would have been muffled almost to inaudibility by the thin air and the man's plastic helmet had the suit not included microphones and amplifiers. It circled, sniffing, while the hawk rose into the alien sky. Riordan did not look closely at the tower. It was a crumbling stump atop a rusty hill, unhuman and grotesque. Once, perhaps 10,000 years ago, the Martians had had a civilization of sorts, cities and agriculture and a Neolithic technology. But according to their own traditions, they had achieved a union or symbiosis with the wildlife of the planet and had abandoned such mechanical aids as unnecessary. Riordan snorted. The hound bayed again. The noise seemed to hang eerily in the still, cold air, to shiver from cliff and crag, and die reluctantly under the enormous silence. But it was a bugle call, a haughty challenge to a world grown old. Stand aside, make way, here comes the conqueror. The animal suddenly loped forward. He had a scent. Riordan swung into a long, easy, low-gravity stride. His eyes gleamed like green ice. The hunt was begun. Breath sobbed in Krieger's lungs, hard and quick and raw. His legs felt weak and heavy, and the thudding of his heart seemed to shake his whole body. Still he ran, while the frightful clamour rose behind him, and the padding of feet grew ever nearer. Leaping, twisting, bounding from crag to crag, sliding down shaly ravines, and slipping through clumps of trees, Krieger fled. The hound was behind him, and the hawk soaring overhead. In a day and a night they had driven him to this, running like a crazed leaper, with death baying at his heels. He had not imagined a human could move so fast or with such endurance. The desert fought for him. The plants, with their queer blind life that no earthling would ever understand, were on his side. Their thorny branches twisted away as he darted through, and then came back to rake the flanks of the hound, slow him, but they could not stop his brutal rush. He ripped past their strengthless, clutching fingers and yammered on the trail of the Martian. The human was toiling a good mile behind, but showed no sign of tiring. Still, Krieger ran. He had to reach the cliff edge before the hunter saw him through his rifle sights. Had to, and the hound was snarling a yard behind now. Up the long slope he went. The hawk fluttered, striking at him, seeking to lay beak and talons in his head. He battered at the creature with his spear and dodged around a tree. The tree snaked out a branch from which the hound rebounded, yelling till the rocks rang. The Martian burst onto the edge of the cliff. It fell sheer to the canyon floor, 500 feet of iron-streaked rock tumbling into windy depths. Beyond, the lowering sun glared in his eyes. He paused only an instant, etched black against the sky, a perfect shot if the human should come into view, and then he sprang over the edge. He had hoped the rockhound would go shooting past, but the animal braked itself barely in time. Krieger went down the cliff face, clawing into every tiny crevice, shuddering as the age-worn rock crumbled under his fingers. The hawk swept close, hacking at him and screaming for its master. He couldn't fight it, not with every finger and toe needed to hang against shattering death, but he slid along the face of the precipice into a grey-green clump of vines, and his nerves thrilled forth the appeal of the ancient symbiosis. The hawk swooped again, and he lay unmoving, rigid as if dead, until it cried in shrill triumph and settled on his shoulder to pluck out his eyes. Then the vines stirred. They weren't strong, but their thorns sank into the flesh, and it couldn't pull loose. Krieger toiled on down into the canyon while the vines pulled the hawk apart. Riordan loomed hugely against the darkening sky. He fired once, twice, the bullets humming wickedly close, but as shadows swept up from the depths, the Martian was covered. The man turned up his speech amplifier, and his voice rolled and boomed monstrously through the gathering night, thunder such as dry Mars had not heard for millennia. "Score one for you, but it isn't enough. I'll find you." The sun slipped below the horizon, and night came down like a falling curtain. Through the darkness, Krieger heard the man laughing. The old rocks trembled with his laughter. Riordan was tired with the long chase and the niggling insufficiency of his oxygen supply. He wanted a smoke and hot food, and neither was to be had. Oh well, he'd appreciate the luxuries of life all the more when he got home, with the Martian's skin. He grinned as he made camp. The little fellow was a worthwhile quarry, that was for damn sure. He'd held out for 2 days now, in a little 10-mile circle of ground, and he'd even killed the hawk. But Riordan was close enough to him now so that the hound could follow his spoor, for Mars had no watercourses to break a trail. So it didn't matter. He lay watching the splendid night of stars. It would get cold before long, unmercifully cold, but his sleeping bag was a good enough insulator to keep him warm with the help of solar energy stored during the day by its Gergen cells. Mars was dark at night, its moons of little help, Phobos a hurtling speck, Deimos merely a bright star. Dark and cold and empty. The rockhound had burrowed into the loose sand nearby, but it would raise the alarm if the Martian should come sneaking near the camp. Not that that was likely. He'd have to find shelter somewhere too if he didn't want to freeze. The bushes and the trees and the little furtive animals whispered a word he could not hear, chattered and gossiped on the wind about the Martian who kept himself warm with work. But he didn't understand that language which was no language. Drowsily, Riordan thought of past hunts. The big game of Earth, lion and tiger and elephant and buffalo and sheep on the high sun-blazing peaks of the Rockies. Rainforests of Venus and the coughing roar of a many-legged swamp monster crashing through the trees to the place where he stood waiting. Primitive throb of drums in a hot, wet night, chant of beaters dancing around a fire, scramble along the hell plains of Mercury with a swollen sun licking against his puny insulating suit, the grandeur and desolation of Neptune's liquid gas swamps, and the huge blind thing that screamed and blundered after him. But this was the loneliest and strangest and perhaps most dangerous hunt of all, and on that account the best. He had no malice toward the Martian. He respected the little being's courage as he respected the bravery of the other animals he had fought. Whatever trophy he brought home from this chase would be well earned. The fact that his success would have to be treated discreetly didn't matter. He hunted less for the glory of it, though he had to admit he didn't mind the publicity, than for love. His ancestors had fought under one name or another, Viking, Crusader, mercenary, rebel, patriot, whatever was fashionable at the moment. Struggle was in his blood, and in these degenerate days there was little to struggle against save what he hunted. Well, tomorrow. He drifted off to sleep. He woke in the short grey dawn, made a quick breakfast, and whistled his hound to heel. His nostrils dilated with excitement, a high, keen drunkenness that sang wonderfully within him. Today. Maybe today. They had to take a roundabout way down into the canyon, and the hound cast about for an hour before he picked up the scent. Then the deep-voiced cry rose again, and they were off, more slowly now, for it was a cruel, stony trail. The sun climbed high as they worked along the ancient riverbed. Its pale, chill light washed needle-sharp crags and fantastically painted cliffs, shale and sand, and the wreck of geological ages. The low, harsh brush crunched under the man's feet, writhing and crackling its impotent protest. Otherwise it was still, a deep and taut and somehow waiting stillness. The hound shattered the quiet with an eager yelp and plunged forward. Hot scent! Riordan dashed after him, trampling through dense bush, panting and swearing and grinning with excitement. Suddenly, the brush opened underfoot. With a howl of dismay, the hound slid down the sloping wall of the pit it had covered. Riordan flung himself forward with tigerish swiftness, flat down on his belly, with one hand barely catching the animal's tail. The shock almost pulled him into the hole too. He wrapped one arm around a bush that clawed at his helmet and pulled the hound back. Shaking, he peered into the trap. It had been well made, about 20 feet deep, with walls as straight and narrow as the sand would allow, and skillfully covered with brush. Planted in the bottom were 3 wicked-looking flint spears. Had he been a shade less quick in his reactions, he would have lost the hound and perhaps himself. He skinned his teeth in a wolf grin and looked around. The owlie must have worked all night on it. Then he couldn't be far away, and he'd be very tired. As if to answer his thoughts, a boulder crashed down from the nearer cliff wall. It was a monster, but a falling object on Mars has less than half the acceleration it does on Earth. Riordan scrambled aside as it boomed onto the place where he had been lying. "Come on!" he yelled, and plunged toward the cliff. For an instant, a grey form loomed over the edge, hurled a spear at him. Riordan snapped a shot at it, and it vanished. The spear glanced off the tough fabric of his suit, and he scrambled up a narrow ledge to the top of the precipice. The Martian was nowhere in sight, but a faint red trail led into the rugged hill country. Winged him, by God! The hound was slower in negotiating the shale-covered trail. His own feet were bleeding when he came up. Riordan cursed him, and they set out again. They followed the trail for a mile or two, and then it ended. Riordan looked around the wilderness of trees and needles which blocked view in any direction. Obviously the owlie had backtracked and climbed up one of those rocks from which he could take a flying leap to some other point. But which one? Sweat, which he couldn't wipe off, ran down the man's face and body. He itched intolerably, and his lungs were raw from gasping at his dole of air. But still he laughed in gusty delight. What a chase! What a chase! Krieger lay in the shadow of a tall rock and shuddered with weariness. Beyond the shade, the sunlight danced in what to him was a blinding, intolerable dazzle, hot and cruel and life-hungry, hard and bright as the metal of the conquerors. It had been a mistake to spend priceless hours when he might have been resting, working on that trap. It hadn't worked, and he might have known that it wouldn't. And now he was hungry, and thirst was like a wild beast in his mouth and throat, and still they followed him. They weren't far behind now. All this day they had been dogging him. He had never been more than half an hour ahead. No rest, no rest. A devil's hunt through a tormented wilderness of stone and sand, and now he could only wait for the battle with an iron burden of exhaustion laid on him. The wound in his side burned. It wasn't deep, but it had cost him blood and pain and the few minutes of catnapping he might have snatched. For a moment, the warrior Krieger was gone, and a lonely, frightened infant sobbed in the desert silence. Why can't they let me alone? A low, dusty green bush rustled. A sandrunner piped in one of the ravines. They were getting close. Wearily, Krieger scrambled up on top of the rock and crouched low. He had backtracked to it. They should by rights go past him toward his tower. He could see it from here, a low yellow ruin worn by the winds of millennia. There had only been time to dart in, snatch a bow and a few arrows and an axe. Pitiful weapons, the arrows could not penetrate the Earthman's suit when there was only a Martian's thin grasp to draw the bow, and even with a steel head, the axe was a small and feeble thing. But it was all he had, he and his few little allies of a desert which fought only to keep its solitude. Repatriated slaves had told him of the Earthlings' power. Their roaring machines filled the silence of their own deserts, gouged the quiet face of their own moon, shook the planets with a senseless fury of meaningless energy. They were the conquerors, and it never occurred to them that an ancient peace and stillness could be worth preserving. Well, he fitted an arrow to the string and crouched in the silent, flimmering sunlight, waiting. The hound came first, yelping and howling. Krieger drew the bow as far as he could, but the human had to come near first. There he came, running and bounding over the rocks, rifle in hand and restless eyes shining with taut green light, closing in for the death. Krieger swung softly around. The beast was beyond the rock now, the Earthman almost below it. The bow twanged. With a savage thrill, Krieger saw the arrow go through the hound, saw the creature leap in the air, and then roll over and over, howling and biting at the thing in its breast. Like a grey thunderbolt, the Martian launched himself off the rock, down at the human. If his axe could shatter that helmet... He struck the man, and they went down together. Wildly, the Martian hewed. The axe glanced off the plastic. He hadn't had room for a swing. Riordan roared and lashed out with a fist. Retching, Krieger rolled backward. Riordan snapped a shot at him. Krieger turned and fled. The man got to one knee, sighting carefully on the grey form that streaked up the nearest slope. A little sand snake darted up the man's leg and wrapped about his wrist. Its small strength was just enough to pull the gun aside. The bullet screamed past Krieger's ear as he vanished into a cleft. He felt the thin death agony of the snake as the man pulled it loose and crushed it underfoot. Somewhat later, he heard a dull boom echoing between the hills. The man had gotten explosives from his boat and blown up the tower. He had lost axe and bow. Now he was utterly weaponless, without even a place to retire for a last stand. And the hunter would not give up. Even without his animals, he would follow, more slowly, but as relentlessly as before. Krieger collapsed on a shelf of rock. Dry sobbing racked his thin body, and the sunset wind cried with him. Presently, he looked up across a red and yellow immensity to the low sun. Long shadows were creeping over the land, peace and stillness for a brief moment before the iron cold of night closed down. Somewhere, the soft trill of a sand runner echoed between low, wind-worn cliffs, and the brush began to speak, whispering back and forth in its ancient, wordless tongue. The desert, the planet, and its wind and sand under the high cold stars, the clean open land of silence and loneliness, and a destiny which was not man's, spoke to him. The enormous oneness of life on Mars, drawn together against the cruel environment, stirred in his blood. As the sun went down and the stars blossomed forth in awesome frosty glory, Krieger began to think again. He did not hate his persecutor, but the grimness of Mars was in him. He fought the war of all which was old and primitive and lost in its own dreams against the alien and the desecrator. It was as ancient and pitiless as life, that war, and each battle won or lost meant something, even if no one ever heard of it. "You do not fight alone," whispered the desert. "You fight for all Mars, and we are with you." Something moved in the darkness, a tiny warm form running across his hand, a little feathered mouse-like thing that burrowed under the sand and lived its small fugitive life and was glad in its own way of living. But it was a part of a world, and Mars has no pity in its voice. Still, a tenderness was within Krieger's heart, and he whispered gently in the language that was not a language. "You will do this for us? You will do it, little brother?" Riordan was too tired to sleep well. He had lain awake for a long time, thinking, and that is not good for a man alone in the Martian hills. So now the rockhound was dead too. It didn't matter, the owlie wouldn't escape. But somehow the incident brought home to him the immensity and the age and the loneliness of the desert. It whispered to him. The brush rustled, and something wailed in darkness, and the wind blew with a wild, mournful sound over faintly starlit cliffs, and it was as if they all somehow had voice, as if the whole world muttered and threatened him in the night. Dimly, he wondered if man would ever subdue Mars, if the human race had not finally run across something bigger than itself. But that was nonsense. Mars was old and worn out and barren, dreaming itself into slow death. The tramp of human feet, shouts of men, and roar of sky-storming rockets were waking it, but to a new destiny, to man's. When Ares lifted its hard spires above the hills of Syrtis, where then were the ancient gods of Mars? It was cold, and the cold deepened as the night wore on. The stars were fire and ice, glittering diamonds in the deep crystal dark. Now and then he could hear a faint snapping borne through the earth as rock or tree split open. The wind laid itself to rest. Sound froze to death. There was only the hard, clear starlight falling through space to shatter on the ground. Once something stirred. He woke from a restless sleep and saw a small thing skittering toward him. He groped for the rifle beside his sleeping bag, then laughed harshly. It was only a sand mouse. But it proved that the Martian had no chance of sneaking up on him while he rested. He didn't laugh again. The sound had echoed too hollowly in his helmet. With the clear, bitter dawn, he was up. He wanted to get the hunt over with. He was dirty and unshaven inside the unit, sick of iron rations pushed through the airlock, stiff and sore with exertion. Lacking the hound, which he'd had to shoot, tracking would be slow, but he didn't want to go back to Port Armstrong for another. No, hell take that Martian, he'd have the devil's skin soon. Breakfast and a little moving made him feel better. He looked with a practiced eye for the Martian's trail. There was sand and brush over everything, even the rocks had a thin coating of their own erosion. The owlie couldn't cover his tracks perfectly. If he tried, it would slow him too much. Riordan fell into a steady jog. Noon found him on higher ground, rough hills with gaunt needles of rock reaching yards into the sky. He kept going, confident of his own ability to wear down the quarry. He'd run deer to earth back home, day after day, until the animal's heart broke and it waited quivering for him to come. The trail looked clear and fresh now. He tensed with the knowledge that the Martian couldn't be far away. Too clear. Could this be bait for another trap? He hefted the rifle and proceeded more warily. But no, there wouldn't have been time. He mounted a high ridge and looked over the grim, fantastic landscape. Near the horizon, he saw a blackened strip, the border of his radioactive barrier. The Martian couldn't go further, and if he doubled back, Riordan would have an excellent chance of spotting him. He tuned up his speaker and let his voice roar into the stillness. "Come out, owlie! I'm going to get you. You might as well come out now and be done with it." The echoes took it up, flying back and forth between the naked crags, trembling and shivering under the brassy arch of sky. "Come out! Come out! Come out!" The Martian seemed to appear from thin air, a grey ghost rising out of the jumbled stones and standing poised not 20 feet away. For an instant the shock of it was too much. Riordan gaped in disbelief. Krieger waited, quivering ever so faintly as if he were a mirage. Then the man shouted and lifted his rifle. Still the Martian stood there, as if carved in grey stone, and with a shock of disappointment, Riordan thought that he had, after all, decided to give himself to an inevitable death. Well, it had been a good hunt. "So long," whispered Riordan, and squeezed the trigger. Since the sand mouse had crawled into the barrel, the gun exploded. Riordan heard the roar and saw the barrel peel open like a rotten banana. He wasn't hurt, but as he staggered back from the shock, Krieger lunged at him. The Martian was 4 feet tall and skinny and weaponless, but he hit the Earthling like a small tornado. His legs wrapped around the man's waist, and his hands got to work on the air hose. Riordan went down under the impact. He snarled tigerishly and fastened his hands on the Martian's narrow throat. Krieger snapped futilely at him with his beak. They rolled over in a cloud of dust. The brush began to chatter excitedly. Riordan tried to break Krieger's neck. The Martian twisted away, bored in again. With a shock of horror, the man heard the hiss of escaping air as Krieger's beak and fingers finally worried the air hose loose. An automatic valve clamped shut, but there was no connection with the pump now. Riordan cursed and got his hands about the Martian's throat again. Then he simply lay there, squeezing, and not all Krieger's writhing and twistings could break that grip. Riordan smiled sleepily and held his hands in place. After 5 minutes or so, Krieger was still. Riordan kept right on throttling him for another 5 minutes, just to make sure. Then he let go and fumbled at his back, trying to reach the pump. The air in his suit was hot and foul. He couldn't quite reach around to connect the hose to the pump. Poor design, he thought vaguely. But then these air suits weren't meant for battle armor. He looked at the slight, silent form of the Martian. A faint breeze ruffled the grey feathers. What a fighter the little guy had been. He'd be the pride of the trophy room back on Earth. Let's see now. He unrolled his sleeping bag and spread it carefully out. He'd never make it to the rocket with what air he had, so it was necessary to let the suspensine into his suit. But he'd have to get inside the bag lest the nights freeze his blood solid. He crawled in, fastening the flaps carefully, and opened the valve on the suspensine tank. Lucky he had it, but then a good hunter thinks of everything. He'd get awfully bored lying here till Wisby caught the signal in 10 days or so and came to find him, but he'd last. It would be an experience to remember. In this dry air, the Martian's skin would keep perfectly well. He felt the paralysis creep up on him, the waning of heartbeat and lung action. His senses and mind were still alive, and he grew aware that complete relaxation has its unpleasant aspects. Oh well, he'd won. He'd killed the wiliest game with his own hands. Presently, Krieger sat up. He felt himself gingerly. There seemed to be a rib broken. Well, that could be fixed. He was still alive. He'd been choked for a good 10 minutes, but a Martian can last 15 without air. He opened the sleeping bag and got Riordan's keys. Then he limped slowly back to the rocket. A day or two of experimentation taught him how to fly it. He'd go to his kinsman near Syrtis. Now that they had an earthly machine and earthly weapons to copy. But there was other business first. He didn't hate Riordan, but Mars is a hard world. He went back and dragged the Earthling into a cave and hid him beyond all possibility of human search parties finding him. For a while, he looked into the man's eyes. Horror stared dumbly back at him. He spoke slowly in halting English. "For those you killed, and for being a stranger on a world that does not want you, and against the day when Mars is free, I leave you." Before departing, he got several oxygen tanks from the boat and hooked them into the man's air supply. That was quite a bit of air for one in suspended animation. Enough to keep him alive for 1,000 years. Remember to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss out on all my releases. And share your thoughts in the comments.
Earthmen Ask No Quarter by Fox B. Holden. Narrated by William Skye. General Taylor knew that Earth could not resist the invaders, so he ordered all units to surrender. But one commander thought he meant Earthmen Ask No Quarter. "Let them in, Sergeant." The white-haired new United Nations World Space Force chief spoke the words as though he had been forced into the most humiliating surrender in history. And he had been. What could he tell them? They were not fools, after all, and he was so impossibly exhausted. Uniform was a mess. All day and all night, words, words, and nothing. Too many useless, powerless words, all adding up to nothing. Foreign space admirals, ground force field marshals, defense secretaries from a dozen capitals. Where were the iron-field cannon that had been promised for the last 20 years? Where were the new main drives? The new alloys? Promises, always promises. But where in God's name were they? And now it didn't matter anymore. He let his massive frame slump tiredly for a moment, elbows flattening some of the official litter strewn across the broad desktop, head in his big hands. "General Taylor, sir?" He forced the thoughts from his brain with almost the same physical force with which he shoved his tired body erect. Yes, thank you, Sergeant. Good morning, gentlemen. Sorry to have kept you waiting." There were perhaps 30 of them, all civilians, all crowding for a spot nearest the huge desk, all with stub pencils and sheafs of rumpled newsprint in their hands. A couple of flashbulbs went off. "General, can you tell us what the aliens' intentions are?" And it had begun. "I'm authorized to tell you that the alien spaceship is hostile, but under the circumstances we are convinced with reasonable certainty that their hostility may be mollified to an appreciable degree." He watched them as they got the official double talk down word for word. And then, "In other words, General, we are counterattacking?" "Sorry, that information is classified." "About how high is the alien, sir?" "He is circling Earth in an orbit about 2,000 miles out, passing our own stations about once every 48 hours. "How big is the ship, sir? About what shape?" "It is a cigar-shaped vessel, approximately 3 miles in length and slightly under 1 at maximum diameter." "Have any of our own ships as yet had actual contact with this craft?" "Yes, there has been contact. I am sorry that for the time being the result cannot be disclosed." "There are rumours, General, that the 402nd Space Wing sent a 5 or 6 ship element of J-83 Lancers from Lunar Base, and that the ships have not reported back. Is this true, sir?" "It is true that they have not been heard from since they left." Then a young, unquavering voice cut in softly. "When is it to begin, sir? And when will we—" "You may write, gentlemen, that the invasion of Earth has already begun, and that we have absolutely no defense against it. None. Because of that fact, the decision of the new UN Joint Chiefs has been that there should be no needless loss of life. You may write that we have already surrendered." His face felt as though it were hewn from wood, a strange wood with a fever in it. He had spoken far beyond his authorization. But they had to know. They could not be lied to forever. And the lies had always, ultimately, been worthless things. He was so tired. "General, can you tell us why?" The group was white-faced, still. The flashbulbs had stopped popping. The first impulse to bolt the General's office for the nearest bank of press telephones had somehow died even as it had arisen. Belief and disbelief mingled as one in the eyes of each. "I'll try, gentlemen," Taylor said wearily, leaning across the desk, his knuckles white against the smooth surface. "I could talk about our stressing of cultural advancement in this 21st century rather than technological, a trend that has always made us of the military fearful of the future, now at hand, but what's the use of rehashing problems of the past? Plainly and simply, gentlemen, the invader is superior to us in every phase of known warfare. Add to that the element of a surprise attack, and you find us as we are at this moment, beaten irreparably." No one said anything. There was nothing to say. General Taylor sank into his chair and stared at them, a grim hopelessness in his eyes. Then the newsmen walked from the room, slowly and silently. Robert Manning, civilian Pentagon clerk, told himself that the invaders might better kill everybody off and get it over with than to just regiment the hell out of everything. A man couldn't even stay home so his wife could take care of his cold for him. He sneezed. If allowed to live it, there were perhaps 40 years of life yet for him. 40 years, and they would be slave years. It was all too damned new and just hadn't got through to him yet. What in God's name was it going to be like? There was a sickness in his stomach, and he knew it was not from his cold. "Manning!" He looked up. It was Sweeney, the chief clerk. Manning always thought of him as a man who should have been a first sergeant somewhere. He was big enough and loud enough, and certainly had temper enough. "Yes, Mr. Sweeney?" "Need these damn records right away. They all here? Each reel double-wound with positive and negative both?" "Yes, sir." Sweeney picked up the bundlesome stack of microfilm reels. "Mr. Sweeney,
what is it?"
Are they going to get 'em? All of Earth's space outpost and military records? Everything?"
"After the Joint Chiefs make out emergency recall orders for every last damn unit, they are. They will check each set of orders against every unit record here, all the way from Corps down to each individual ship."
Sweeney grunted.
"Then they'll burn 'em, positives, negatives, everything. Then when the ships come in, they will destroy them too."
Manning felt something turn over inside him. "General Taylor..."
"What the hell can Taylor do? Christ, you're better off than he is. Once every ship is back here and busted up, he won't even have a job. Maybe not even a head."
"Every ship. They're all there, Mr. Sweeney. Positives and negatives double-wound on every reel."
"They better be. Or you won't have a damn head."
Sweeney turned and steamrollered out of the office with every existing record, past and present, of General Taylor's new UN World Space Force under one beefy arm. For security reasons, Manning realized, there had been made but a single copy and negative for each of its units. His desk was an old one, practically an antique dating back to the 1940s, and his sonotyper was buried deep in its insides on a wooden shelf that folded out to meet you in an awkward manner when you pushed the desktop up, over, and down. Manning pushed, and with a couple of bronchial grunts, produced the sonotyper. He fed in a continuous paper spool, turned on the current, unhooked the compact microphone from the machine's side, and began dictating the rest of his day's work. Something got kicked viciously out of the keybed. Black shiny squares of something. All he needed was for the sonotyper to go haywire and start shooting its complex insides all over. He stopped dictating to remove his glasses and dry his streaming eyes. His vision cleared, and for an instant settled on the shiny things that had landed near the front edge of his desk. Hunks of microfilm. He picked them up, held one to the light. Words. He fished in a drawer, found a magnifying glass that was used for half-obliterated old files. He could see the words better, but they were backwards. He had the negative. Impatiently he grabbed the other square, and read it. And shivered. And again it wasn't his cold that was bothering him. He would have to call Sweeney right away. Light Space Brigade Experimental. Temporary Outpost Callisto. Force 20 Lancer-type J-88 destroyers. Complement 600. Commanding Colonel Jeffrey Steele. He felt his insides turning to cold jelly. He would have to call Sweeney. God, Sweeney would skin him alive. Somehow the tail ends of one of the double-wound reels must have stuck out a little, got sliced neatly off when he'd hastily jammed its pan cover back on after inspecting it. Then the severed squares of microfilm had slipped down, unnoticed, through one of the desktop cracks where the Sonotyper foldaway unit was, and landed in the keybed. Only Sweeney wouldn't understand it that way. And the Joint Chiefs. Oh, God, no. He had to think. And he thought of that other name. On the microfilm record, Steele it was, who commanded 600 men, 20 J-88s. He thought of 40 years of slavery. And then he was doing a crazy thing. Crazy. While no one looked, Robert Manning sneezed and blew his nose and touched the flame of his cigarette lighter to the 2 squares of microfilm. The white-faced communications sergeant stood just inside the door, and this time he failed to be impressed with the unusual smartness of the colonel's acknowledging salute. The thick sheaf of yellow papers he held in his left hand was trembling visibly, noisily, and he couldn't make it stop. "Well, Grady, what is it? You look as though you'd picked up a telepath message from one of our Callistan cap crawlers or something." He reached out for the quaking message the sergeant held, and the communications man smiled nervously and held it out to him. "Sorry, sir. I guess I just... No trouble, boy." The stocky black and silver uniformed figure paused in its movement, the thick pile of yellow papers momentarily forgotten. All of Steele's personnel seemed like sons to him. Even the raw recruits who had previously never been further out than Earth's own moon. Sometimes, during the lonely hours there had been in the fastness of space, he had surmised it was because there had never been a real son of his own with whom to share the adventures of his calling. But hadn't it been space itself that had denied him those many things other men could take for granted, the things for which he had never quite been able to trade? 40 years of it. Venus to Pluto. Deep space at the system's rim and beyond, to the very edge of infinity itself. Sometimes this deep hurt within him seemed too great, and yet somehow it seemed always worth the venture. One day, no matter the cost or the hurt, men's outposts would be flung to the stars themselves. This thing he knew. The sergeant was speaking, and there was a fear in his eyes. "Something's happened home, sir. You better read this right away. All the way to the very end, sir." Steele ran a freckled, stub-fingered hand slowly and deliberately along the close-cropped iron-grey side of his squarish skull. "Attention all stations," the message read. "Urgent imperative. Earth has been successfully invaded. The rapidity, timing, and infallibility of the attack has made the necessity of immediate capitulation unquestionable. The following listed units are therefore commanded, for the good of the planet, to return to home Earth bases at once, with all armament either completely dismantled or destroyed. The conquerors have warned that failure to comply with this command will result in wholesale liquidation of Earth's populace." The long list of outposts followed for 15 closely spaced pages. The message was signed Taylor, General, New United Nations World Space Force, Commanding. Steele suddenly felt himself struggling to keep order for full-scale attack bottled in his throat. Then he fought to keep from simply cursing. He fought to keep the hot, quick panic in him from boiling into some unthinkable suicide. The sergeant still stood before him, the thing of awful fear deep in his eyes. "Get Major Zuko at once, Sergeant."
"Yes, sir. But, sir—"
"What is it?" His jaws hurt, and he could feel the words hissing from between his teeth.
"The list, sir. We're the smallest and newest unit there is, so we lie right at the bottom, page 15. But we're not there. We're not listed at all, sir."
He looked. Grady was right. And okayed and signed by Taylor himself, no mistaking that. "Get Major Zuko, Sergeant. On the double."
"Yes, sir."
The communications non-com stumbled awkwardly. Acclimatization to lesser gravities came quickly only with long experience. He recovered, and then in a curious loping fashion began to run. For terse seconds, Steele spoke clipped words into a unit communicator. And then he waited for Zuko. It would be a moment or so yet. He looked at the message again, reread it, tried to glean information from it that it didn't contain. It told what, but it didn't tell why. Nor even how. It was just a command to be obeyed like any other command. No, it wasn't the soldier's place to question. Never the soldier's place to question. Here is an ideal, they would say. Here is the thing you must work or fight for. Here is what is worth believing in. And the soldier believed. If he did not, he was fortunate, for then he just had a job to do. But if he believed, he was the most hapless creature in the universe. For sooner or later, the ideal wore thin as a facade for the more practical expediencies which moved behind it. What true ideal there was with the soldier, yet his was not the freedom to serve it, and when the ideal was suddenly scrapped, when they said now it is all over, now this is what you must do, here is a new thing to believe. 40 years, from the bogs of Venus to the wastes of Pluto. He looked again at the list headed All Units, and checked them one by one. Grady had been right. Experimental simply wasn't there. Maybe an experimental light space brigade on a dark little world like Callisto could get lost in the shuffle. But he knew better. With Earth at stake, Taylor would allow no such error. Taylor knew every one of his units by heart. He must. He thought about Taylor. He thought about him the way he had known him as both soldier and individual, as general and as a man. Character, principle, guts. The three biggest things about Taylor. A man who followed orders to the letter, a man who would surrender of his own volition no matter what price to pay the piper. That was where the principle came in, the character, the guts. He looked at Taylor's facsimile signature again. Signed by force? By threat? Obviously. The message itself said as much. But if somehow there'd been a mistake, a record overlooked, Taylor would know, and would... But who else would know? At a glance, who else would know? And then, how much would Taylor dare? For one of the rare times in his life, Steele was frightened to his core. "Colonel Steele, sir!" Major Zuko snapped a perfunctory salute, put himself at rest, and lowered his towering, square-cut body into a laxer chair. The healthy pink in his broad face and the purposefulness in the set of his clean-cut features made him look younger than he was, and the close-cropped black hair was like an added insignia of his profession to his perfectly fitted uniform. "You'd better take a look at this, Georgie. And then we've got to get things moving." Steele handed the order across his desk. He waited while Zuko read. He watched Zuko's face. It seemed to gradually coagulate. and when he was finished, Steele said, "Now find us on there." "But I don't. Anything else? Any other details? Is this—" "It's as true as the leaves on your shoulders, Major. And that's all there is so far. Grady will be in with anything else when and if it should come. Well, what are you thinking?" "Thinking? If this damned thing isn't some criminal joke, there's no thinking to it, Colonel. We just go, period. I'll get—" "Just a minute. Did you try to find us on there? What do you make of that?" "A mistake. Some clerical mistake, that's all. What else could be made of it? On an order like this?" Steele shifted in his swivel seat, and a neglected spring squawked its protest. "Suppose," he began slowly, "it was a mistake, Major. But Taylor put his name to it anyway, just the way it is. Now, do you think he'd be likely to miss such an error?" Zuko hesitated, a scowl corrugating his wide forehead. "No, I don't think so. But whether he was likely to or not hasn't anything to do with it. The mistake was made. He didn't catch it, but he signed it, sent it, and it means us like all the rest of them. Period." "I think he caught it, Major." "What do you—" "I mean just that. He caught it, and still signed it." "Colonel, don't be crazy. With a gun in his back?" "Just the point. The people holding the gun would of course have grabbed the records as a check against Taylor's written command. It's the only way they'd have of knowing what was what. They'd do all they could to make sure they were given the complete works, of course, but ultimately they'd have to trust Taylor, trust his fear of their terrible power and staggering advantage. Only, let's say there was a mistake. One way for it to be caught. Taylor. He'd know at a glance, the one man who would. And he still signed it." "Nuts, Colonel, nuts. What you are suggesting is absolute nonsense. With the lives of billions of people in the balance, you mean he'd—" "Leave it up to us." "With only 20 J-88s? With a planet full of people in the balance? Sir, do you think Taylor's a lunatic or something?" Steele groped for an answer that would take the cold logic out of Zuko's questions. The exec had to be wrong. There must be an answer. "Zuko," he heard himself saying at last, "there were only 3 of our craft out today, all behind the big boy, and I've ordered them in, damped and clammed up. I've grounded the rest. And if we don't get anything from communications within the next couple of hours, like a notification of error and correction—" "You must be out of your head, Colonel." Zuko stood up, towered over the big desk. Veins in his wide forehead stood out redly, accentuating the growing colour in his stiffened face. "In a couple of hours we go into eclipse. Not for long, but while we are, we won't be able to pick up anything. Suppose then the notification comes. While we're working out some crazy plan, still thinking Taylor was trying to pull a cute one. Do you think we can take a gamble like that? Do you think we have the right to take a gamble like that?" "As it is," Steele replied slowly, "our people are to be slaves. For all we know, forever. A little dramatic, aren't you? Would you call it a situation to be taken lightly?" The other straightened, said nothing. "Major, Taylor was taking a shot in the dark. We're a fantastically slim hope, but we're the only one he's got. And I think that right now you are a greater enemy to Earth than all her invaders." "Liberty or death, Major, that's what Taylor was saying to us when he knowingly put his signature to a fluke error." "Oh, for God's sake, Colonel, come off it. It sounds just Jim Dandy, but you haven't even got a plan. Infinity to 0, those are your odds. And if I thought you were seriously considering not going in, I'd... Yes, Major, you'd what? The door opened. It was Grady. There was a communication folder in his hand. Silently, Steele took the folder. There was an expectant look on Zuko's flushed face as his superior read the brief message. Then Steele looked up. "No," he said. "It's not a notification of error and correction. Simply a follow-up directive ordering all recalled craft to navigate the final 10,000 miles of their Earth approaches in intervals of not less than 20 minutes each. Seems the invaders have their entire headquarters and supply set up in a mothership circling Earth, and they aren't taking any chances." "Under these conditions, then?" "As far as we're concerned, Major, the conditions are the same." For a moment, Zuko stood immobile, his dark eyes snapping down to lock with Steele's. But the colonels did not flinch. And then the Major pivoted and left Steele suddenly alone in the small office. He had hardly completed the all-units bulletin when the call buzzer from operations sounded. Within the next hour, his 600 men, his 20 small J-88 Lancers, would be loaded to the fins with all the arms they could carry, and then... Fleetingly, the thought nagged at him. Was Zuko a coward, or right? 20 tiny J-88s balanced against the lives of 4 billion people. Yet there would be surprise, and the overconfidence of a powerful victor after an easy conquest. And more, there would be the will of a small band of men. He flipped up the buzzer switch, and the operations lieutenant appeared on his small desk viewer. "Yes, Lieutenant. Did your group have some difficulty in understanding my bulletin?" "No, sir. We're getting things space-shape at our end right now. But, sir, you said that 20 craft were to be prepared." "Yes, that's correct. All of them." "But there will be only 19, sir. Major Zuko blasted off nearly a half hour before your announcement, in a completely unarmed J-88 and, he said, on your authorization." For a moment, Steele said nothing. His mind seethed, yet he understood. "Very well, Lieutenant. You will stand by for a second bulletin." The young officer's face faded from the screen, and Steele tried to think. Obvious, of course, but he wondered how much Zuko could be blamed. A frightened man, a coward perhaps, doing what he thought was right. But it was not right, and they must now act swiftly. For if the enemy were warned in sufficient time... Infinity to 0, Zuko had said, were his odds. Perhaps. But there would be 19 J-88s armed to the fins. They had kept Zuko waiting 3 hours after he landed. He had immediately been placed under guard upon setting the unarmed Lancer down at National Spaceport, and they had not believed him until his shouts of protest had been overheard by one of their officers. It had almost been for nothing. But now they were taking him to the Pentagon, into Taylor's own suite of offices. And Taylor was there. A different-looking Taylor than Zuko remembered, no longer the bulky, solid-looking figure. One, drawn, as were those few of his staff working with him under the orders of the alien commander. It was the alien who spoke. Taylor sat white and silent. "My officers inform me that you have attempted to convince them of an impossible story, Earthmen," he said. He was man-like, only taller. His head was bald and like a fleshless skull, and there was the glitter of a strong intelligence behind the widely spaced double-lidded red eyes. And Zuko repeated his story, Shamefully, fearfully, he told it. And as he did, new colour flushed Taylor's lined face, then subsided to the whiteness of helpless anger. "Your story will be checked carefully," the alien commander said in a slurred yet fluent English. "If it is true—" And that was all he said. There was a sudden flurry of movement, and General Taylor had wrested a weapon from the alien's belt. He squeezed its trigger in quick, desperate spasms, squeezed. Zuko lay headless on the floor. Zuko, the alien commander, and his guards. "Hide them! We've got to hide them!" Taylor was yelling at his paralyzed aides. "If Steele can pull it off, can wreck that hellish mothership of theirs, they'll be cut off down here, done for. Come on, for God's sake, help me!" They sprang into action then, and with the weapons from the slain aliens, waited silently behind the bolted office door. Taylor's wasted frame was tensed. Minutes, hours, or death in seconds, perhaps. They could only wait. They came out of the sun. 19 flat, finned, streamlined shapes, orange flame gouting from them as from the lips of hell itself, hurtling headlong with some terrible vengeance glowing in their overheated tubes. Then space was suddenly gaping holes of searing colour, bursting soundlessly as the 19 became 17, 14, 12. The 12 became 10, and it was as though the bowels of the sun itself had erupted to the right and to the left of them, and everywhere before and behind them. 8 of them completed the first pass, and already there were yawning holes in the gleaming hide of their enemy. They turned, came on again. Their torpedo tubes sparkled, and 5 full salvos struck. The alien mothership spilled white flame from a gaping rupture in her flank, and 3 ships were left to close a second time. Then 2 flat-finned, streamlined shapes did not pull from their pass. They hurtled instead, headlong into the wounded juggernaut's very heart. Drunkenly, and with almost deliberate slowness, it split in two, a slain thing spewing its broken structure and shattered creatures with crazy abandon toward the great blue seas of Earth beneath. One now there was, its flagship insignia half scorched from its twisted, battered hull. Yet it hurtled through the blackness of space toward the planet below it, the flush of victory shimmering in its overheated tubes. There was little to be said. General Taylor stood at the side of the white hospital bed, and Colonel Geoffrey Steele, his head swathed in bandages, looked questioningly up at him. "General, did Major Zuko—" Taylor's mouth was grim. "He reached us, and the aliens. But we managed to take care of the situation, to give you time." The general's features softened. "You and your crew, a magnificent job. Earth is proud." "We were lucky, sir," Steele attempted a grin. "Tried hard not to make any mistakes." Taylor smiled then, his laughter an emotional release they had both been seeking. "I occasionally overlook mistakes," he said. And then the 2 men laughed together. For a long time.
Hit the like button to support the channel and help this video find other listeners. Thanks.
Menace from Vega by Randall Garrett and Robert Silverberg, writing as Robert Randall. Narrated by William Skye. Why would strangers abduct an insane girl from a psychiatric ward? Jim Lawrence found out that to answer this question, he had to face a menace from Vega. The tall, darkly handsome man was grinning at Dr. James Lawrence from the wrong side of a gun. "Don't do anything foolish," the stranger said. The psychiatrist swallowed and looked at the muzzle of the weapon. The gun didn't look like any he had seen before, but he had no doubt that it was deadly. "What do you want?" he asked. He had never faced a gun before, but he found, oddly enough, that he wasn't at all frightened. There was simply a tense expectancy, a feeling of what's coming next, and no more. "You have a patient at this hospital named Bet Bauer?" It was half a question, half a statement. Jim Lawrence looked at the intruder without answering. He knew Bet Bauer, a tall, beautiful brunette with deep grey-green eyes. There was nothing behind those eyes. She had been in St. Paul's neuropsychiatric hospital for 3 years, a schizophrenic catatonic completely out of touch with the real world. "You're behaving childishly," said the man with the odd-looking gun softly. "All I have to do is look through your files. Where is she?" Lawrence shrugged. "Ward 3, room 41. Why do you want to know?" He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. "It doesn't matter," the stranger said. "Come along. Lead us to where she is confined." Outside the office there were 4 men. They held their hands in their pockets as though there were guns there. Lawrence glanced from one to another. They all looked somewhat alike, all with that same dark slimness and hardness of feature. "What do you want?" Lawrence demanded. "Just take us to Bet Bauer," the leader said. "If you do not, you will be shot." He smiled. It was the sight of that smile that made Jim Lawrence realize the cold dangerousness of the man. "Very well," Jim said. "Come this way." As he led them down the hall toward Ward 3, Jim wondered about these men. What interest could they have in Bet Bauer? She had once been a brilliant physicist and had shown signs of actual genius. But something had happened to her shortly after she had received her doctor's degree in theoretical physics. Her mind had become unbalanced and she had been committed to St. Paul's Hospital. As chief psychiatrist, Dr. James Lawrence had worked with her regularly. He was deeply interested in the girl. But he had been completely unable to break the dazed, trance-like state that she had been in for the past 3 years. What did these 5 men want with her? And who were they anyway? There was something odd about them, even aside from the peculiar gun that their leader carried. Their clothes seemed wrong, as though they weren't used to wearing them. Their speech was strange in some undefinable way. When they reached Ward 3, Jim Lawrence took the keys from his pocket and unlocked the main door. A night nurse at the desk looked up and smiled. "Good evening, Dr. Lawrence," she said sweetly. Then she saw the men behind him and her eyebrows lifted. "We want to see Bet Bauer," Jim said, keeping his voice even. "Certainly, Doctor." She led the way down the corridor to room 41. It was a padded cell, with Dr. Bet Bauer, naked to prevent her from harming herself with her clothing, lying on the floor, crooning mindlessly, her grey-green eyes staring out into nothingness. The dark man said, "That's her. Pick her up." As the 4 silent followers moved forward, Jim saw that the leader was watching them. He had taken his eyes off Jim himself. Lawrence reached out and made a grab for the gun, but the dark man was a move ahead of him. He moved away smoothly, whirled, and brought the gun down stunningly on Jim's head. Jim threw a wild, wobbly punch at the man, and then the other 4 moved in on him. He fought back blindly for a few moments, but then a fist raked across his jaw, another smashed into his stomach, and the gun descended a second time. It caught him on the side of the head, and he sagged to the floor. The thick padding was the last thing he felt before he blacked out. The pain of awakening was worse than the pain of the blow. Jim's head throbbed as though there were a motorcycle engine inside it. When he opened his eyes, the pain became worse. A brilliant light was shining directly into his eyes. He winced and closed them again. "Dim the light," said a softly slurred voice. Jim opened his eyes again. This time he saw what was standing over him, and he recoiled in horror. The being looked vaguely reptilian, but there was a touch of the insect about it too. It was green in colour and covered with scales like a fish. It stood on 2 legs, towering above him and gazing at him with bulging, faceted, insect-like eyes. After the initial reaction of disgust came another thought. "I've got to get out of here." He rose to a sitting position, swung out with a fist. But the creature ducked lithely away from the blow. Cold hands on his shoulders pressed him down again, and he knew it was futile to attempt to fight his way out. He closed his eyes again, hard. "You are afraid of us," said the soft voice. "You fear me because of my appearance. Please do not. We mean you no harm, Dr. Lawrence." The thing was calling him by his own name. Lawrence shook his head to get the cobwebs out of it. What was going on? It had been an ordinary, peaceful day. Then 5 hoodlums kidnapping Bet Bauer and that blow on the head. And now this. Reptilian creatures with glittering eyes. Lawrence opened his eyes again. The scene remained the same, but this time he could see 3 similar creatures in the background. What are you?" And then, as he saw more of his surroundings, he asked, "Where is this?" The alien said, "You are aboard our spaceship, Dr. Lawrence. We are following the Vegan ship." In spite of the alien's terrifying appearance, Jim sensed a curious friendliness in its voice. I'm afraid I don't understand. Those men..." The lizard-like being with the insect eyes sat down on a chair near the bunk. "Dr. Lawrence, I am Nestiv Ilon. I am the captain of this ship, which is a war vessel in the stellar navy of Viagon. We are following the ship of Ansu Miro, the being who has kidnapped your Dr. Bet Bauer. Jim sat up in the bunk. "Just a minute," he said, holding up a hand. "I may be having a nightmare, but I still like to be sure of what's going on. The last I remember, I was trying to keep a bunch of gangsters from kidnapping one of my patients. Now I find myself here. Suppose you start from the beginning." "I see," the alien said. "I did not realize you were so unfamiliar with the situation. Those men who took the girl were working for Ansu Miro. He is attempting to gain control of the entire galaxy, a goal at which," the alien said, its voice drooping sadly, "at which he is unfortunately succeeding." Lawrence blinked. "How?" "His race is telepathic to a certain extent. They can read the minds of most other races, although they cannot read each other's minds." "These are the Vegans?" Lawrence asked, trying to keep the story assembled into a coherent pattern. "Yes, they are the Vegans, a warlike people who are now trying to overthrow the galactic government. 3 years ago, Miro contacted the mind of a brilliant young Earth girl who had discovered a weapon of great significance, a death ray to be precise." "You mean Bet Bauer?" "That was the girl's name. Miro discovered her shortly before we did. My race is telepathic too. We found that Dr. Bauer had discovered a system of mass annihilation that would enable any group to take over the galaxy, but Miro had her first. He focused a mind-static generator on her and drove her insane. Naturally, he wanted the secret, so he came here to Earth to get it as soon as he decided it was safe. By that time we too had found Earth and followed." "Only Miro had already grabbed the girl," Lawrence said. "Exactly. We were too late. And now you must understand the situation." Yes," Lawrence said uneasily. "All but one thing. Why did you drag me into this?" The alien paused for a moment and said, We found you unconscious and decided to take you into protective custody. But why? The Vegans have no use for me. No, Nestive Ilon said gently. But we do. Another of the reptilian beings approached at that moment and inclined its head toward Ilon. What is it? We're approaching Vega 9, sir. Very good, Ilon said. Shift into transparency warp and go into orbit. Yes, sir. The subordinate inclined his head once again and backed away. Ilon turned to Jim Lawrence. We are within striking range of the Vegan home base now. Here's where you come in. What do you mean? Lawrence asked. The alien rose. It is impossible, of course, for any of us to enter the Vegan base, since no disguise will conceal our fundamental physical appearance. But you are of the same general somatic type as the Vegans. A little eyeshadow, a bit of plastotech applied here and there to change the facial contours, and I think you could pass. You want me to dip into the Vegan base and rescue the girl, is that it? Yes, Elon said. Oh, very nice, but then what? Do I hand the death ray over to you and let you conquer the galaxy? No thanks, I might as well let the Vegans do it. Elon shook his head sadly. We have no such plans, Jim Lawrence. We are only concerned with keeping the annihilating ray out of the hands of the Vegans, with placing it in the sane custody such a deadly weapon deserves. How can I trust you? It will be necessary, I'm afraid. You must believe that we plan no aggression of our own. No, there is a way to prove it to you. He leaned down and spoke rapidly into a microphone. A few moments later, an alien appeared bearing a gleaming chromium helmet. He handed it silently to Lawrence, who examined it curiously. What's this? Put it on, Elon said softly. How do I know it's safe? You have my word it's safe. Suspiciously, Lawrence lifted the helmet and placed it on his head where it fit snugly. A stream of images filtered abruptly through his mind. The helmet was a history book. It was a thought record that stretched back over centuries, over millennia, detailing the eon-old conflict between the Vegans and Nestive Ilon's people. As the story unfolded, Lawrence could see the cold malevolence of the Vegans opposed to the wise, kind people of Viagon. Through a pattern of cosmic conflicts and world-destroying wars, Lawrence grasped the history of the two peoples. Vega had been threatening to extend its empire throughout the universe, but had been checked at every point by the Viagoni, the guardians of civilization. Finally, Lawrence removed the helmet. It seemed that he had lived through the history record for hours, but a glance at his watch told him that no more than a few seconds had passed. Nestive Ilon was staring patiently at him. Well? Lawrence smiled. I'm with you, he said. The small scout ship slipped easily through the hatch of the Viagoni cruiser and spiraled down into the atmosphere of Vega 9. Aboard, Jim Lawrence rocked in his deceleration cradle and tried to form a strategy for landing. By the time the Viagoni medics had finished with him, he was the very image of a Vegan, thin and dark, sinister-looking, tight-faced. That might get him into the Vegan base, but how was he going to get out? He shrugged his shoulders. I'll worry about that when the time comes, he told himself. Now he waited while the remote-controlled scout ship brought him closer and closer to the planet below. Finally it dropped to the ground. He stepped out and found himself in the midst of a vast, bleak plain. About a half-mile to the east, a cluster of little buildings was evident, the upper portions, Ilon had told him, of the fortified underground Vegan base. He crossed the plain at a quick trot and slipped into a group of silent Vegans who were coming out of one of the above-surface buildings and heading toward a shaft that apparently led downward into the base. They were clad in overalls and looked like workers.
None of them spoke to him as he joined their ranks. He moved along down into the shaft with them. A fantastic underground world opened before his eyes. Great lights overhead cast illumination on the scene. Buildings reared up 10, 15, 20 stories. Massive machines pumped pistons back and forth, booming noisily. It was a gigantic base, a center for the conquest of the universe. And somewhere in the heart of all this, somewhere was Ansu Miro and the mindless body of Bet Bauer. If Miro had the chance to restore the girl's mind and drain from her the secret of the annihilating ray... But he didn't want to think about that. He kept going with the group of workers he had fallen in with and found that they were marching toward a squat, windowless building that was the center of a good deal of activity. The Vegans he was with were silent men, dark-faced and taciturn, and he was thankful for that. There was none of the genial camaraderie that might have been present between a bunch of Earthmen in a similar position. He followed them into the building and discovered that it was a tool dispensary of some kind. Each man was marching up to a closet and taking forth something that looked like a large, heavy brush. Jim dropped back toward the end of the line and chewed at his lip. No doubt the tools would be apportioned one for each man in the squad, which meant they would be short one. And he didn't want the men he was with to suspect anything. He wanted to stay with them at least until he had formulated a more definite plan of action. He lingered at the back of the line, looking around. There was no one behind him. He reached out for the man just in front of him and whacked him across the throat with the edge of his hand. The man coughed and retched, and Lawrence clamped a hand over his mouth to silence him. Another quick blow and the Vegan dropped. Quietly, Lawrence dragged him away and deposited him in a closet nearby. Then he returned to the line. Now there would be one broom for each man, no more. When everyone was supplied, they marched solemnly back out the door of the supply room. Obediently, Lawrence followed along. No one seemed to notice that a man was missing or that there was a stranger in the group. They marched to the middle of the plaza, and there the first man in the group bent and pried off a manhole. Then the Vegans began disappearing even further into the earth. Tunnels within tunnels. His turn came, and he followed on down into the tunnel. For the first time, one of the Vegans spoke, barking a short instruction in a harsh, guttural language. Lawrence heard the sound of air blowing through pipes, then the sound of machinery grinding, then the slow whistle of the airflow ceasing. He realized where he was and what the crew was about to do, and his heart surged. He had a plan now. He was in one of the air shafts that fed the great subterranean Vegan base. The air had just been shut off in this particular tube, and the crew of Vegans he had joined was about to set to work scrubbing the tube, ridding it of any impurities that might have accumulated. Now he knew what to do. As he scrubbed merrily through the shining length of the tube, he began to form his strategy. It involved getting out of the tube for one thing, and getting to a medical office if they had any such thing in the base. That was the first step. He counted to 10, then threw his broom in the air and uttered a piercing shriek. Then he fell to the ground, panting and gasping, and lay there flat against the cold metal of the air shaft. Instantly his co-workers gathered around him. 20 dark, unfriendly faces peered down, and they began to gabble something in their language that probably was the equivalent of, "What's the matter with you?" He lolled his head from side to side as if to indicate that he had suffered a stroke of some kind and couldn't speak. Drawing on his psychiatric experience, Lawrence offered a good imitation of a catatonic seizure, so convincing that before long he himself had burst out in a cold sweat as he lay rigid there. Another Vegan came over, evidently a superior, and rattled out a quick command. Immediately, 2 of the broom workers put down their tools and hoisted Lawrence between them. They began to march back through the airshaft with him, up and out into the plaza again. They carried him into a tall, gleaming building which was presumably the medical office. He allowed one corner of his lip to curl upward in a smile of satisfaction. So far, so good. 2 doctors were in attendance. They studied him closely, tapped him, prodded him, and held long colloquies with each other. After a few minutes of this, one of them disappeared into the adjoining room of the medical office, apparently to prepare some sort of test. The other Vegan doctor took a few steps back and consulted a bulky red-bound volume on his desk. Apparently he'd never seen a seizure like this before. With one bound, Lawrence was off the bed and at the doctor's side. He whirled him around, smashed a fist into the medic's lean jaw, another into his stomach. From behind him came a shout of surprise as the other doctor returned to the room. Quickly, Lawrence scooped the unconscious doctor up and hurled him at the other. They both went down in a shower of crashing glasswork, and Lawrence sprang on top of them. 3 solid punches did the job. He hastily ripped strips from the bed and bound them securely. Then he began to prowl through the drug cabinet. It wasn't easy trying to read the labels in the alien language, but James Lawrence was skilled in the handling of drugs, and before long he had found what he wanted despite his inability to read the labels. It was a pain-killing drug, one that was in use on Earth as well as Vega. He could tell by the familiar sugary taste of the white powder that this was the stuff. Humming softly to himself, he slipped the bottle under his overalls, waved farewell to the sleeping doctors, and ducked out the door. 5 minutes later he was back in the airshaft, wielding his broom energetically. He forged on to the front of the group, heading further and further along in the airshaft until finally he came to the place he was looking for, the tube that led to the heart of the air supply. He looked around. No one was watching. He pushed open the door to the tube and slid quietly inside, trotting lightly until he reached the central pump. "Sweet dreams," he said thoughtfully as he inverted the bottle of the drug into the feeder that led to the pump. With that stuff filtering through the air, the whole base would be out like a light within an hour or so. There was enough knockout potential in a bottle of that stuff, he thought, to keep everyone under wraps long enough for him to find Bet Bauer and get the blazes out of here. Getting out was a harder job. It involved threading his way through the maze of air shafts once again, getting past the swabbing crew, and out into the open. But he made it. By now the air was beginning to smell sweet, and he knew the drug was taking effect. The problem now was to locate Miro. But that proved to be simple. Lawrence headed across the plaza toward the pair of great buildings that seemed to be the administrative sections of the base, and stopped the first Vegan he saw. "Ansu Miro?" he asked. The Vegan looked blankly at him. "Ansu Miro?" Lawrence repeated with great urgency. The Vegan pointed to the building on the left and uttered a stream of words. Lawrence smiled politely and headed toward the left-hand building. After he had gone about half the distance, he noticed the increase in the sweetness in the air. He stopped, ripped off his shirt and wrapped it over his mouth and nose. That would be ample protection. By the time he reached the building, the guards posted outside were safely asleep. He seized one of the strange pistols from them and entered. Where to find Miro and the girl, he wondered. Vegans were sagging into sleep all over the lobby of the building. Shrugging his shoulders, he decided there was only one way. He would have to look in every room of the immense building. But he didn't have far to look. After about 10 minutes' search of the slumber-wrapped building, he stepped into an ornate, impressive-looking building and found Miro. Awake. The thin Vegan whirled in astonishment as Lawrence entered. He was at the back of the room, bending over the nude form of Bet Bauer. Lawrence noticed a strange odour in the room, even through his improvised face mask, and it wasn't the odour of the drug he'd slipped into the air system. Angrily, Ansu Miro ripped out a barking sentence in Vegan. Then his eyes narrowed. "Oh, the Earthman. How did you get in here?" Lawrence's pistol rose. "Get away from that girl, Miro. Get away or I'll shoot you." "Just try," Miro chuckled.
He calmly drew his own gun from its holster, and Lawrence realized with a shock that he was as good as unarmed because he did not know how to use the Vegan gun. He hurled the useless gun at Miro and dove behind a chair just as the Vegan's pistol fired. A section of the wall caved in. Lawrence peered out, then ducked back as he saw Miro looking for him. Cautiously, he began to thread his way along the side of the room toward Miro. "Don't move, Earthman," Miro said coldly. "I see you."
"But you don't see me!"
cried a new voice. Surprised, the alien turned, and in that moment Lawrence sprang and hit him with all he had. The gun went flying from the Vegan's hands. He struck back, but Lawrence parried the blow and smashed his fists into Miro's face. The alien rolled over and lay still. Lawrence glanced up at Betbauer, who had spoken.
"You saved my life," he said. "And you mine."
She reddened and snatched a drape from the wall to cover her nakedness.
"Miro was just about to drain my mind for—"
She paused. "I know what for," Lawrence said. "I know the whole thing." He glanced around. "I might have known," he said. "Miro was using some kind of drug on you, wasn't he?" She nodded. "There's time for explanation later," Lawrence said. "The Viagoni are waiting for us to take us back to Earth and to safety."
"What about Miro?"
"He'll go with all the rest of them," Lawrence said. "When we've built your annihilator and when we've wiped out this cancer spot of the universe. Let's go." He took her by the hand and they raced through the sleeping Vegan base to the waiting Viagoni ship.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these stories, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on so you don't miss all the new ones I narrate. There are even more over on my Substack in ad-free audio, video, and podcast formats. Link in the description. And please share your thoughts, ideas, and memories about these stories in the comments below. It's always a pleasure to read them. See you in the next one.